Well, folks, hello and welcome to another fantastic episode of RfRx. My name is Eric Wells, and I am the support group director for Recovering from Religion. And with me today, you've seen her before. She's a regular co-host with me, Kara Griffin, RfR helpline agent. Hey, Kara.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. You do such a great job, and I enjoy having you here when you're here.
Shucks.
Well, folks, like at the beginning of every RfRx, we have a poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch this. And this poll, like all of them, are kind of designed to get you in the mindset of what we're going to be talking about tonight. It's got 3 questions. And the first question is the decline of religion inevitable? Yes, no, or I'm not really sure. Question number 2, can humanism take the place of religion? Yes, no, I'm not sure, or I don't know what humanism is. There's a choice number 5, which should have been deleted. Don't select choice number 5. Question number
Seems
3.
Like people are selecting that choice.
Yeah, they are. Oh, crap. Question number 3. What psychological and social needs must be most met for people to fall away from religion naturally? Supportive community, credible alternative philosophy, higher social acceptance, a better God or gods, something else, or nothing is needed. So that poll is going to be running while we do this whole intro, and we'll kind of close it out when we start to introduce our fantastic guest. All right, so I've gone through this whole first part, but what the heck is RfRx? Why are we here, Kara? Tell us.
Great question, Eric. RfRx is the best part of the week. And it's also a series of online weekly episodes where we have guests come on and discuss topics that might be relevant to people in RfR, which stands for Recovering from Religion. And it's not meant to be a replacement for our online community or our support groups, but it is meant to be a complement to those communities. So we have people who come on, like our guest tonight, who provide some really good advice and coping skills that are hopefully relevant to people that come to these meetings and shows. And so, by the way, if anybody has a topical question or comment or idea for a topic they'd like to go over, or also death threats, we've established that those can be sent to our email address at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. And also, all of these recordings or all of these shows go on to YouTube. And so you can find old shows from every week on YouTube on our channel, Recovering from Religion, as well, if you want to catch up on any previous episodes.
Yep. And we have been using the initialism RfR, but that stands for Recovering from Religion. And we're a nonprofit organization. We really rely on folks' willingness to volunteer and to donate their hard-earned money. But we're not just here just to kind of goof off and mess around, but we actually have a mission. Our mission, underlying all that goofing off, foul language and fun times, is actually a mission. Let me just rephrase that whole thing. And our mission is to offer hope, healing, and support to those struggling with issues of doubt and non-belief. And so you heard those 3 things: hope, healing, and support. We've designed and created quite a few services, quite a few programs around those 3 words. And so let's tell you how we're offering hope, healing, and support. So Kara, start off with healing.
Yeah, absolutely. So healing is mainly what we do through our helpline, and that is available 24/7, either via chat online through our website, or if you want to call on the phone, you can do that as well. And you'll call in or chat in, and you'll reach an agent who's been thoroughly trained in RfR, who's going to be just an empathetic ear. They're not going to be judging or criticizing or proselytizing or deconverting or anything like that, but somebody that's probably been through this process and is able to kind of understand, hopefully, what you're going through and offer some resources that we have available. Also, you can just visit directly our resources page if you would rather do that instead of chatting in on our website, recoveringfromreligion.org/resources. And there's just a whole slew of resources on there that you can look up, whether it's about issues that you're encountering with a particular religious practice, or how to let people know that you've come out of religion, or whatever the case may be. Go on there. There's probably a resource that will be of interest to you. And so that's also available in addition to the chat line. that you can chat or call into. And oops, sorry, that's my dog barking. Just a moment. Okay, I think he's done. Sorry about that. He is not a trained agent, as you can see. But also, in addition to healing, we also offer hope, which is what we try to accomplish through just sharing and listening to people's personal stories that they've agreed to put together for us. And kind of the idea behind that is that we're all in this together, and we may share some similar struggles or benefit from inspiration of hearing someone else's story. And so we have a blog and a podcast where people are able to share those things, and you can visit either of those. Our blog is on medium.com/excommunications, and our podcast is again on our website, recoveringfromreligion.org/podcast. And then we also have support, which is Eric's very most favorite. Would you like to tell us about that?
I do. Folks, the Recovery from Religion Support Group program is such a fantastic program. I see the helpline, what Kara had talked about earlier, sort of like the emergency room. I'm going through an existential crisis now. I need a resource now. So I'm going to call or chat into the helpline, talk to one of their agents. The support groups, on the other hand, this is not professional support. This is like peer support, just like the helpline, but it's really designed for that long-term healing that we may find we're going to need once we kind of transition or begin to transition out of religion. I know that the thing that surprised me when I transitioned out of religion is like, it wasn't like a switch that just flipped off and all of the old beliefs I had in the past were gone and replaced by new ones. No, there was some work that I had to do to root out these things, figure out what was going on in my head, and talk to and get to talk to other folks who were kind of struggling with something similar. So that's what the support groups are. These are face-to-face meetings, small, intimate meetings where it's a safe space for us to share and talk about our trauma, our questions, our doubts, and just what's been going on, because there is a lot of stuff that happens as we transition out of religion. There are currently 64 groups around the entire world, and you can find the nearest one at the website that's in the description or the chat or what have you. Now, in addition to that, we talked about the two peer support programs, the helpline and the support groups. We may need more than what peer support can offer. We may need someone who has been professionally trained, has gone and done a ton of schooling and is well-versed in the treatments that help folks the most when they're struggling with some mental issues or just big, tough problems in their life. And so we've set up as the Secular Therapy Project. And this is where folks like myself, clients like me and you, can connect with licensed professionals who have been vetted by a fantastic group of therapists in the Secular Therapy Project to ensure that they have their appropriate licensing in their state or their country, to make sure that they're maintaining a secular practice, so you won't run the risk of being proselytized to. And they're also vetted to ensure that they use only evidence-based treatments. So that's the Secular Therapy Project, and you can find them at seculartherapy.org. I can go and drop that link. There we go. So you're kind of hearing all of these fantastic programs, and there was one piece that we were missing. And one of that piece was kind of the community aspect of it. Hey, I am I'm not really, but I'm kind of just saying this esoterically. I'm a secular parent, and I just kind of became a secular parent, like transitioned out of religion. How the heck do I raise kids in a secular manner these days? And so we have set up the online community, Recovering from Religion online community, where folks like this brand new secular parent can go in and talk with other secular parents who kind of struggle with the same thing in a very specific channel. So you can go and meet and talk with folks who are struggling with some very similar issues that I may not be able to relate to, but that doesn't mean it's any less valid because you're going through it right now. So we have got channels in this work, in this online community for like current and former military folks, ex-Mormons, ex-Muslims, LGBTQ, and all sorts of different unique aspects in categories that you might fit in with. If you're interested in kind of checking this out and getting to know some other folks who are struggling with the same things you are, you're going to have to start with the helpline. Head on over to the helpline, and because this is not a publicly available space. head on over to the helpline, talk to an agent, whether on the chat or on the phone. They'll ask you a few questions to see if you're a good fit and send you an invite to the Slack workspace. Next, you may find yourself already kind of like, all right, I'm super comfortable being a non-believer now. I'd like to kind of get myself plugged into a new community. And if you're looking for one of those and it's online, check out the atheist community of Discord. Right now, they're streaming this very program into their channel, and I freaking love it. They're a great organization, and a lot of the folks from Recovering from Religion are also over there and as moderators or participants. So I'm going to drop that link, that invite link, into the chat, and I don't need to drop it into the Discord channel because they're already there. Okay. So what else, Kara? What else we got?
Well, so in addition to all of that, healing, we found, can also come from helping others. And a lot of volunteers, such as Eric and myself and our wonderful troll smashers and everyone else here at RFR, find a lot of meaning and purpose in being able to help other people working through that same process that we went through, leaving religion or working through whatever those issues might be. And it turns out we are always in need of more volunteers. We have all of those programs and services that we just described, and those are all completely run by volunteers. Nobody's getting paid to do any of this. It's all volunteer donated time and everything like that. So if this sounds like something that you might be interested in helping out with and getting involved in, and you might be available or qualified or interested in doing any of those things, whether it's working in the helpline or the support groups or the online community, or even if you have other kinds of skills like technical skills, project management, whatever the case may be, look into seeing about volunteering if that's something you might be able to do. And you can find a link to that on our website, recoveringfromreligion.org/volunteer. And that will explain what the process is to apply to get involved in volunteering and what that process will look like. And we do offer training for things like being a helpline agent and stuff like that. You don't have to already come being an expert or anything like that. Anybody can look into it and see if it sounds like it might be for you. So definitely check that out if you feel so inclined, if the spirit moves you, as it were. I'm just kidding.
As it was.
As it was, as it might or might not have been. But nevertheless, there it is. So I guess that's probably enough of us yammering on. Let me tell y'all about the format of our show for this evening. Just like every Monday night, we'll have discussion with our guest, who's really awesome. I'm super excited. That'll go on for about an hour, and then we'll have what we usually do is we have a Q&A session at the end. We're going to probably, in this case, work the Q&A session kind of into the discussion as well. So just like always, if you have questions during the program, go ahead and type those into the chat, and Eric and I will be collecting those both from the Zoom chat and from the Discord. So whichever way you're viewing this, put those questions in the chat, and we'll be collecting those and discussing them with our guest throughout the program. After that's finished, we'll have some closing thoughts by our wonderful and amazing and exciting founder and president, Dr. Darrel Ray. And then after that, we'll just, like we always do, turn off the recording, and we'll go to our hangout, which is some people's most favorite part of the show, where we get to just stay and chat and talk amongst each other and ourselves. And I believe our guest is going to be able to stay for probably at least the first part of that. So we'll look forward to that. And that usually goes on for quite some time, and our lovely Hangout hosts will be there to facilitate that as well. So without further ado, Eric, are you ready?
I am ready. Folks, I am so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Mark Reimers. He is a computational neuroscientist at Michigan State University, where he researches how animal brains work and how human genes affect brain function. His broader aim is to ground our understanding of feeling and thought in facts of biology. Dr. Reimers was raised a Christian, but found a path to humanism in his 20s. Since then, he's been a humanist leader and a speaker for over a decade in Virginia and now in Michigan. Dr. Reimers, welcome. I'm so glad you're here this evening.
Thank you, Eric. Glad to be here, and hope we'll have an interesting discussion. So,
yeah, the room is packed with well over 100 people here, and I think that this topic is going to be pretty darn interesting with them.
Great. Well, I look forward to it. And as I've told the organizers, I'd like to do, part of what happens in a humanist meeting is you get to ask questions and you get to raise objections. There's no final truth. And so I'm going to pause at several points during the presentation to sort of take questions and respond to them or arguments. And remember, nobody has the final truth. All right, so I'm going to take as my starting point the question that gets asked so many times now, which is there something about our human nature or our brain wiring that makes us be religious? Those of you who have come through Campus Crusade for Christ will remember the phrase, there's a God-shaped hole in the human heart. Is there any truth to that? Or can we say anything about that from neuroscience and biology? And I'm just taking two leading thinkers who've answered this in completely opposite ways, Richard Dawkins and John Gray. And just as a little bit of a look forward, I think there's a good deal of truth in both of them, but I will probably come down a little closer to what Dawkins says. But we'll see how that goes. So if we want to ask this question about something about all human beings, something about human nature, one quick test we can do is sort of cross-cultural comparison. So, we're used to a particular kind of Western society, but that's really a minority among human experience. So supposing we look across a variety of societies, and I recall being quite struck when I first visited Thailand to see the kinds of ornate religious architecture that I had only seen in Catholic churches in Europe previously. But even though they had evolved or developed quite independently, they had arrived at a lot of the same kinds of observances and practices and even architecture. So you might get the sense that, well, maybe religion is sort of deeply wired in us. But then if you look even more broadly, if you look at sort of primitive agricultural societies, you find very different kinds of religions. And if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, you see that they have practices that, they might be called religious, but they're very, very unlike any kind of religious practice. And keep in mind that human beings lived more or less like modern hunter-gatherers for most of human evolution. And that's that's in some sense the true reference we should be looking at, not necessarily other civilized people who live in organized societies, because we're really kind of atypical. We are not, in some sense, normal. So let's start with a couple of questions, and feel free to answer these in the chat. So if you're looking for a biological explanation of religion, what aspects of religion do you think are most likely to be explainable? And what kinds of biology do you think is likely to be useful in explaining those? But I would say, religion is a human behavior, so we would look for some biological explanations in the organ that directs behavior, that is the brain. But we might also look for explanations in terms of physiology or in terms of genetics. So let's take a look at how those pan out. So first, some bad news. And this is, I think, characteristic of all rational attempts to explain deep aspects of human condition, is that we don't have a coherent scientific account that explains all of the diverse religions and all of the individual differences in religiosity. We have mostly indirect evidence, and it's based on relatively few studies. You can't get grant money from the US government to study religion in the United States. You can in Europe. The good news is that we do have some convergent evidence. We have about brain activity during religious experience. and about what those brain regions do in other studies. So we do have, I think, enough that's worth at least presenting at this point. But as I said at the beginning, there's no final answers, and the expectation should be that the knowledge about this biology of religion will grow over the next several decades. I'm going to show you lots of these pictures of brain activation, and you've probably seen these in popular science journals. Again, these are idealizations and averages of data. These are not any one person's brain activity. So you should always, take anything you see with a healthy dose of salt, and just look for convergent evidence. So let's start with religious practices and religious experiences. And let's start with the quintessential religious practice, which is prayer. So what happens in your brain when you pray, or when you did pray? It's been a long time. So again, a lot of Christians have cooperated, and some members of other religions have cooperated in religious practice studies. And the idea is you try to measure brain activity. In this case, Schut gave them instructions to pray, some Norwegian Lutherans, in an MRI scanner, and reported that the area of the brain that became the most active was the striatum. Striatum is an area sort of at the center of the brain. I don't know if you can see my pointer. I'm sort of tracing out that. Can you see a pointer?
Yeah, we
or
can
not?
see your pointer. Is that earlobe looking thing? Is that the hypothalamus?
Hypothalamus would be down here.
Okay.
So you'd be looking at, so this is sort of a C-shaped structure in the middle, sort of right in the middle of your brain. If you think of your brain like a coconut, this would be the coconut and this would be the husk.
I love you describing the head and skull as a coconut. That's fantastic.
So striatum's involved in lots of things, but perhaps it's most involved in desire. And that's a consistent theme. So a number of other people have done similar studies and found similar activation. Probably some of you came through Pentecostal religions, and you may have engaged in or heard speaking in tongues. And I don't think I need to debate, whether there's any languages being spoken, but there has been at least one study of glossolalia and finds a kind of paradoxical thing, more activation in the parietal cortex and a sort of suppression of some of the activity in the striatum. This is a little hard to interpret. I'm going to make a guess at what I think is a plausible interpretation, but this is not by any means the final word. The parietal area is sort of at the back half of your brain, and there's an area just to the, right at the sides of those called the temporoparietal junction, and that's critical for self-other discrimination. And as that may break down, you'll get different kinds of activity in that area. So this is a plausible but not necessary interpretation.
Now, when you say self-other determination, that means I can distinguish myself from everything else around me? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. So what, are you at, this is an area that seems to act strangely when people have these mystical experiences of union with the universe or union with God. And speaking of mystical experience, there have been several studies of, again, attempting, can you make someone have a mystical experience on demand in a brain scanner? Well, maybe, but you can ask them to try, and some of them are good sports and are willing to try. And so, again, you see these same sort of these parietal areas and also a medial area that will come back to. The medial frontal area and these back parietal areas are going to be a recurrent theme in this presentation. So it's a little hard to interpret, but again, you see some areas are active. You can also ask the reverse question: what areas are inactive, or what areas prevent mystical experience? And here, there's been a different kind of study that's been more popular, and that is veterans returning from wars, or people who suffered occupational injuries, often can be tracked for decades, and you can ask them about their religious experiences. And it turns out that people get brain injuries all over the place, but most of them don't have much effect on religious experience, except with prefrontal lesions. People with prefrontal lesions tend to have many more mystical experiences than normal, and certainly than people with other kinds of brain injuries. So I think we can say that there's certainly some correlates in the brain, but at the moment, there's not a complete story about this. So I've talked about sort of mystical experiences that many people have, but what about these really extraordinary mystical experiences, these so-called near-death experiences? And every decade or so, there's a big furor about them, and someone claims to have proved beyond a doubt that there's a soul after death, etc. And I think you've all seen these kinds of images. I want to isolate the key claim here, and that is death is assessed for a human being by the heart stopping. And whether that is really stopping brain activity is a key assumption behind this. And the usual argument by the people making these claims are that, well, as soon as the blood flow to your brain stops, your brain can't function. You're running out of oxygen. The brain's a very energy intensive organ. And this is, of course, something that's you're not going to test on a human being for obvious reasons. So could you test this claim empirically in an animal? And actually, a woman named Borgian at the University of Michigan, just down the road from me, tested this about 10 years ago and published in the National Academy of Science about 6 years ago, where she stopped the hearts of rats while she had electrodes in their brain. How she got funding for this, I don't know, but it's not an expensive experiment, so I imagine it wasn't too hard. And what was interesting was that she found very rapid brain activity, which is usually a hallmark of sort of conscious, what we think of as conscious perception, well after the heart was stopped. And the key here is that although you see on this EEG, it looks like all these big waves are just coming to a stop, right? And that's what people normally say, okay, the brain has stopped. But if you look closely, the fine waves, which are the faster waves, which are the ones that are usually associated with perception. So these big slow waves are typically associated with sleep, and in this case, anesthesia. But these fast waves are typically associated with perception or action or attention. And those are continuing for up to 30 seconds in this rat after the heart has been artificially stopped. And I think we have some reason to think that the human brain might go a bit longer. But of course, as you know, when you have suddenly awoken from a dream, you can dream an awful lot of stuff very quickly when you don't have to act it out. So I'm going to give some tentative summaries right now, and that is that generally speaking, there's more activation of the striatum or basal ganglia, is another name for that, during prayer or religious observance. And that's the same region that's active whenever you experience intense longing or intense desire, whether that's for sex or money or food or ambition, what have you. I think, at the moment, we don't have a coherent explanation, but we can say that a lot of this, religious practice is to some extent, sublimated desire. And that's something that I think some of the psychologists have suggested before. So let me pause here and take questions or objections.
Yeah, real quick, I like how you said the religion seems to be sublimated desire. How could we determine, like, if these spots of the brain that were lighting up weren't necessarily like an antenna that was receiving something from a spiritual dimension or something like that? How can we be sure that it's really material and not like some supernatural thing interacting with those spots in the brain?
So I guess you'd have to, in order to answer that question, you'd have to have some limitations on what kind of interaction, what kind of energy transfer, or what kind of process might be reaching into the brain from the ethereal realm. In fact, our modern EEG started with someone asking that very question and thinking that perhaps trauma experienced by soldiers at the front could be broadcast by radio waves, which had been just discovered, and reach somebody's brain. And so he started recording from people's scalp, and he thought he was detecting radio waves, but in fact, he was detecting the intrinsic oscillations of the brain. And that's where our EEG started. So let's say that as far as any kind of force that we know of, electromagnetism or the strong force or weak force or gravity, none of those really can penetrate the skull to any significant degree and affect the actions of individual cells within the brain. If you're imagining some sort of force field beyond our current physics, of course, I can't falsify that. I can't provide any evidence why that couldn't be true. But the levels of activation that people are recording are well within bounds for normal human experience.
Is prayer different when someone asks the experimental subjects to pray as compared to what might be happening when they're doing it on their own, or is there a way to tell?
That's a fair question. That's something that bedevils all sort of neuroscience experiments about complicated human mental processes. Is it the same? And of course, they're in a noisy machine. They're claustrophobic. It's probably not as good. So that's a fair point. But at the moment, this is the best we can do. There's similar results we get with EEG, which is a lot less noisy and less invasive, although less specific.
That makes sense.
I know here in the U.S., for a long time, we couldn't have really done any experiments with like psychedelics, but I imagine there are starting to be some studies that are coming out that kind of are looking into psychedelics inside of and brain function. Have any of them, or do you know of any of them that have kind of compared these the areas that these psychedelics activate versus the areas that people, when they have religious experiences, are activated?
That is exactly the question I was trying to research before this talk. And I couldn't find any published work yet addressing that question. I know that people are asking the question. Psychedelic research has just become sort of quasi-legal in the US. And it's still very hard to act. Labs take a while to get up and running, and so I'm imagining that those sort of experiments are being done this year, or would have been done this year if they hadn't been blocked by COVID, and probably we will see some reports of them within a few years.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another question that some people were wondering about too was, in these studies, have they ever done it where they had some people who believed in God who are praying, and then another, like a control group of people who don't actually believe but are like going through the motions of praying? And is there some difference when people either are truly believing in it or just doing the action but don't believe?
Fair question. And actually, I'll be talking about such a study with regard to belief, not prayer, in just a minute. So why don't I transition to the next stage?
Yeah, we did that on purpose. Perfect segue.
Okay. Now we've talked about religious experiences, but what about belief and faith? So the experiment that I think is closest to what Kara was asking about was by Sam Harris, and that's the same Sam Harris who wrote the atheist books, and he actually did a PhD in neuroscience for his own interest, and one of the studies he did was to read religious creed statements and sort of commonly agreed factual statements to two groups, some of whom were believers and some of whom were atheists. And the two main conclusions that I'd like to highlight are, first, that generally speaking, your brain works harder to disbelieve, to be skeptical, than to accept a suggestion or to agree. So generally, overall, your brain is working harder when you disagree or you are not accepting what someone's saying, with one important exception. And I shouldn't say just one, but with a couple of important exceptions in terms of the regions that are working less, or in other words, they're working more when you are believing or accepting what someone's saying. And those are these I'm going to highlight this area in particular, this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So we're looking at a sort of 3D image of a brain as if it's been split right down the middle. And I can tell you, no people were harmed in making this picture. This is a magnetic resonance image. Nobody's brain was actually split, but this is what you would see if you were to split the brain right down the middle. So this is this frontal area right behind your eyes. And you can see that that's an area that is much more active when you are accepting, when you're engaging and assenting to what someone's saying. So this is an area that the believers would be activating, but the non-believers would not when they're talking about religious statements. The other areas that are active are back here in the close to the temporal-parietal junction, and the area that I mentioned before. Again, are you sort of separating yourself from this person, or are you sort of entering into a sort of at least kind of rough union of mind with them? And so those are, I think, those are the key areas. He did a follow-up study where he's looking at which areas are more activated in religious people by religious statements. And again, it's mostly medial areas. This figure is very complicated, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's these areas. Now, it's not just Sam Harris. There's several other people who've done similar studies. Again, the Howlett and Paulus study was contrasting testable versus, in principle, empirical statements versus statements that, could only be believed or not. They couldn't be tested. And they find broadly the same kinds of things when, looking at testable, statements of faith tend to activate these, medial prefrontal areas. Here, this is a sort of blown up version of those previous images. And they also activate these temporal parietal junction areas, the areas right where the temporal cortex, this area meets the parietal cortex, this area. So it's nice to see a completely independent study finding more or less the same things. That's not always true in fMRI studies, so it's makes it, I think, more credible. So what, okay, so I've just talked about brain regions, but I haven't told you anything about what they do or why we should care or what this means. So let's just take a step back and ask about, well, what does this ventromedial prefrontal area actually do and why is it special? And what it does is that it's the area that's most active when people are reflecting on or thinking about or fearing for their closest relationships, that is with their parents or children or spouse or community or with God, if they're religious. So this is an area that is very strongly activated when people are concerned about losing a very, very important relationship. And so this is, and if you have wronged somebody, like you wronged your spouse, and you're really upset about this, that's the area that's working very hard. Okay, now this is an area that we share, of course, with other primates, as we share just about every brain area, except that it's proportionally much, much larger in human beings. So again, if you sort of scale up a chimp brain, you'll get something that looks more or less like a human brain, except for a few areas that are like 5 times bigger than they should be. And this is one of them. And so it's, I think you can argue that it's selectively been very important for human evolution. I think another argument for its importance is that there have been this massive expansion in the projections from that area to the other parts of the brain. So there's massive axon tracts going from these medial prefrontal area and orbital frontal areas to both to the other frontal areas and also to your temporal areas where you're sort of holding your memories. And so there's much more connection, and also they've recruited much faster connections than chimpanzees do. So I would argue that both the large size and the intense wiring suggest that this is one of those critical areas for human brain evolution, and that's been an important part of our evolution as a species. So, I think we can come back to that and, start thinking about interpreting some of these earlier studies in terms of, what those brain areas are doing. And it seems that a lot of what they're doing is, in fact, something that's been selected for, and that is maintaining these long-term relationships. Now, there's certainly, actually, maybe I'll skip this slide just in interest of time. So what about some of the other aspects of religion other than prayer or belief? What about, let's say, self-righteousness, or one of the complaints that many non-religious people have is that religious people like to tell others what to do and how to live. And what can we say about, brain activity when you're telling someone else, how to live? And that is, it seems that two kinds of concerns that motivate that kind of telling people how to live are, first, a concern with purity or sanctity, and second, a concern with authority. And those two concerns seem to have distinct patterns of brain activity. The concern with sanctity seems related to higher activity in these sort of lateral regions. So here we're looking at a human brain with a little bit of the sides scooped out. So you're seeing a brain region that you never actually see in typical presentations, and it's called the insula. And it's fairly large in human beings, but it's also very active when you feel disgust. So if you're walking by the garbage can, or your neighbor's dog has done its business on your lawn, that's an area that's very active. It's also an area that's very active if you feel that someone's cheating, or been morally suspect. So that's certainly an area that is very active in a concern with purity, and it seems that concern with authority correlates with high amygdala activity. The amygdala kind of gets a lot of bad press. We sort of think of it as one bad part of the brain, just mediating fear and anger. That's not really true. It's a very complex place, and at least in children, it's as active when they're expecting something good as when they're expecting something bad. And people with a sunnier disposition actually keep some of that. They maintain activity even when you're anticipating something good. But maybe it says something about our society that for most of us, the amygdala activity is usually associated with unpleasant emotions like fear or anxiety. Again, we're trying to interpret this data, and I think we probably have a clearer interpretation than for for religious experience, in that a lot of these studies, and certainly there have been similar studies of political ideology, and they all find activations of these regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that are related to close social relationships, and to loyalty, and also regions related to self-other discrimination. So I think we can at least tentatively draw a conclusion that that religious beliefs are not primarily about rationality or about making sense of the universe. They're primarily about maintaining important social relationships. And for, if you think about, for many people, and again, this is perhaps more true now in America than it is true now in Europe, but for many people, churches are the place where they can make, those relationships. So let me pause here and take any questions or comments.
Are we seeing these some of these same areas of the brain light up in animals other than humans? And I really do like how you brought up one of our close cousins, the apes, and kind of the difference in size of that area that deals with community, how we perceive and are connected to community. But you also mentioned some other places in the brain where when we think of prayer or possibly have a religious experience light up. Are we seeing any areas like that? Are there analogs in other animals?
There are analogs in primates, but there don't seem to be clear analogs. There certainly are not clear analogs for either of those areas in rodents. And I don't know enough about the wiring of elephant and dolphin brains to tell you yes or no about those. But I think, generally speaking, the prefrontal areas are most different in the different orders of mammals. So I wouldn't be surprised if those are, what we're seeing is perhaps limited to primates and perhaps a few other animals.
And would you mind giving us a real quick tour of the brain, like like it seems like you're talking about a roadmap, like frontal, and then the prefrontal is before that. Is there like a quick way we can kind of
Sure. Okay, so frontal cortex is basically everything ahead of the halfway point, and that includes, let's say, motor cortex, which operates sort of my arms and legs, and then prefrontal is basically everything in front of that, which sort of organizes my actions, or at least we like to think organizes my actions. Temporal refers to the sides, And we have this
Well, like your
really
temples.
large folded over temporal lobe, which is important for memories. And parietal is sort of most of what's behind the midline until you get to the visual at the back. And that's, again, very, very crudely involved in sort of orientation and keeping track of where you are in space, or where imagined objects are in space.
And the amygdala is way down.
No, the amygdala is again in the center. So you remember those pictures I showed of the basal
Okay.
ganglia. Basically, you think of the cortex space, it's just a word that means rind. And so if you think of any kind of fruit, most of the older, long-standing parts of the brain are in the core, and the rind has sort of a little overgrown in humans. So amygdala and striatum and thalamus and hypothalamus, they're all sort of in the center, and they're usually two of them.
Got it. Thanks. Kara?
Yeah, so we had another question. Someone was wondering also about dopamine and whether that is involved in any of these religious experiences, or when people are praying or believing, and wondering, is that maybe also something that would be encouraging people to continue to participate in these experiences, possibly even like an addictive type of thing?
That's a very good suggestion, and I think that's likely to be true, but I'm not aware of any data that actually confirms that. It's hard to measure dopamine in living human brain. You can sort of tap people's cerebrospinal fluids, but that's pretty invasive and pretty disruptive. I'm not aware of any study, done for non-health reasons of measuring dopamine.
Got it.
But it's plausible. I think it's likely true.
Now, there's recently, well, I guess within the last decade or so, a new tool that I think neuroscientists have, like the transcranial magnetic stimulate. Like you basically are directing a magnetic field to like some very specific points in the brain. And from what I understand, some of these, if we point this tool at that part of the brain that are lighting up in these MRIs, that they're getting the same experience. So is that it seems to me like it's like another bit of evidence that, hey, what's lighting up in the brain? And
yes, you can induce some weird experiences. I think there's a fellow in Sudbury called Persinger who does some of these kinds of experiments. And so I think there's some evidence, but it doesn't seem, to my knowledge, it has not yet been sort of formulated into coherent theory. I almost mentioned Persinger, but didn't. Well, let me go on a little bit further then. This is the last third. So let's talk about, some of the other things that get bandied about, like mental illness and genetics. So is it true that religious feeling is heritable? So I think we'd all agree that a specific religion is not in your genes. Nothing in your DNA codes for Christian or Muslim or animist or Buddhist or Hindu. So, but we might ask whether certain aspects of your approach to religion, whatever religion you're participating in, whether those are heritable or related to specific genes. And there was a study in 2010, a colleague and friend of mine was one of the authors, to estimate, the heritability of different aspects of religiosity. And this seemed promising because, it seemed that certain aspects of that you might consider religious have different kinds of heritability, which suggests that they're really distinct. So spirituality overall, a sense of, there being something more to this world, was 50% heritable, which seems rather high. Love and forgiveness was very unheritable. But surprisingly, the idea of the focus on a personal relationship with God was quite heritable. So this was very promising. This is only 11 years ago. But we haven't found any genetic variants that actually are related to any of these traits. So you'd think if something's 50% heritable, you'd ought to be able to find some genes that carry that heritability. But we can't find any. There was a book published, I think 16 years ago, called The God Gene. And it was about a vesicular monoamine transporter 2, which is involved with dopamine. So it's a reasonable hypothesis. But basically, nobody's been able to replicate that. I know the author personally, and I'm not surprised. I think we'd have to say that there's suggestions of some of these aspects of religiosity being related to genes, but so far we haven't found any. Now, to be fair, most of the behavioral traits that we were confident we would find genes for turn out to also have very, very tiny effects. We found lots of genes related both to mental illness and to behavioral traits, but it turns out that there's no one gene for extroversion or one gene for schizophrenia. There's thousands, and they all have very tiny effects. So it's very, it's very hard to predict from looking at someone's DNA whether they're going to be an extrovert or an introvert or religious or not. So I think we have to, at the moment, say it's not looking very likely that there's going to be a strong association yet. Well, we can look at maybe some other, biological measures, like what about brain structure? So brain structure is certainly influenced by genes. So what about some of, values that are often associated with religion? So, for example, group loyalty or authority is typically a typical conservative value that's often associated with religions. And a nice study about 9 years ago found what, to my mind, are some of the biggest effects we've ever seen, correlating brain anatomy with specific behaviors. And it wasn't a small sample size, so I think that there's some merit to this. In particular, again, not surprisingly, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the size of that has a fairly high correlation with various social measures, how much you value loyalty, as well as how many friends you have. And it's also correlated with, a deference to authority. The interpretation of this is a little hard because we're, so many things are correlated with so many other things that it's like a nutrition study. Everybody who eats any one thing healthy, the study finds that that's associated with, lower risk of heart attacks, et cetera. But of course, they're all doing 100 other things that are healthy as well. And so it's very hard to attribute it to a specific cause. And the same thing is true with these correlation studies here with the brain size. So it may not be the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, it may be some other thing that's correlated with that. And also, we have a little bit of a question of cause and effect here. Generally speaking, a brain region is larger if there are either more cells or more connections between the cells. And certainly, if you use a brain area a lot, you grow more connections. It's harder to grow more cells, but you can easily grow more, or not easily, but with a lot of work, you can grow more connections. So we don't know if it's the people who care about these things that are, developing more connections or synapses in these areas, or whether it's they were born that way, and they've become more socially oriented.
Real quick, Mark, would you mind explaining what you mean, what this means, like 55% correlated or 45% correlated? It's a little over my head right now.
Sure. So if you were to plot, let's say the size of, I should have had a picture. If you plot, let's say on one axis, the horizontal axis, you plot, your brain, the size of that brain area. and you plot on the vertical axis how many items they endorse in a questionnaire that asks, do you value, this aspect of relationships, let's say, more than, something else like money or fame or what have you. And basically the people who endorse more of those items saying, I really want to be loyal to my friends more than lots of other things, will tend to also be the same people who, out on the axis, who have these larger ventromedial prefrontal areas.
So depending on the spread of the dots along that range is kind of gives you that percentage of correlation?
Yes, right. So 100% correlation would be perfect alignment. One is completely predictive of the other. 0% correlation means they have no relationship to each other. Probably a better measure is, predictive accuracy, which is typically the square of correlation. And in this case, we're looking at a predictive accuracy of 25 or 27%. So it's not, it's not the case that you could just look at someone's brain scan and say, okay, that person has 135 friends.
But you could almost say, like, there's a 25% chance that this person has 135 friends.
You could say, let's say there's a 70% chance that they have more than the average number of friends.
Got it. Okay, got it. Great, thank you.
Okay. Well, let's also consider neurological issues. Some of you may know someone with Geschwind syndrome. So people with temporal lobe epilepsy become increasingly obsessed with religion over the course of their life and tend to write a lot about religion. So you may know somebody like that. And this has been observed for quite a while, that temporal lobe epilepsy seems to increase obsession with religion. So that leads us really to the question of psychiatry, religion and mental illness. And I think many atheists would like to believe that religion causes mental illness. And and certainly we get this in the news. It's very frequent, when someone who's psychotic or has a psychotic break and does some violent acts, so that they get in the news. And remember that most people who are psychotic do not commit violent acts. It's a small minority, but of course they're the ones who are in the news. And it's fairly common that the newspaper will say that the person says, well, God told me to kill all of these infidels, or God told me to kill these other people. And we think, oh, that's religion causing that. Well, the data suggest two things. First, that people who are psychotic talk a lot more about religion. They use religious imagery a lot more in describing their life experience. And that's perhaps suggestive of something. But if you look at the actual rate of psychosis, how many religious people, have a psychotic break versus how many non-religious people have a psychotic break, the numbers aren't really that different. So at least, religion certainly is very prominent in many psychoses, but it doesn't seem to be a cause. What about depression? This is one that you often get into arguments here in the United States with people who tell you, well, even if you don't believe in God, if yourself, you have to admit that believing in God is good for you because it seems to be associated with less depression, which is of course the most common kind of mental illness here. So most American studies, in fact, find that moderate religiosity, so not your flaming fundamentalists, but people who are seriously religious, but not fanatics, have a lower rate of depression than atheists or agnostics. That's been found a number of times. However, the studies in Europe don't find such an effect, and a few of them actually find higher rates of depression among religious people in Europe. So that seems like a bit of a paradox, because we usually think of European and American societies as pretty similar. But I think this is probably the most common opinion, but it's not the final word. It seems that the protective effect for depression in the United States is mediated partly by the fact that you have a community here that which in a country where it's hard, where most of us are strangers, and partly by the sense of certainty or sense of meaning in everyday life. So one study has actually said, well, let's not look at agnostics, because this is a whole mishmash of people who, including a lot of people who don't know what they believe or why they believe it. Let's look at people who are serious atheists, and this study found, and of course it was done by an atheist, which I think is fine. And I think it was the right discrimination to make. Found that that the people who knew what they believed were just as healthy emotionally as people who are moderately religious in the U.S. So that there's essentially no difference. And I think that's the fair comparison. So let's come back to the question that I started with: are people wired to be religious? And I think both Dawkins and Gray are correct in that religion is not something that's evolved or been selected for specifically, but I would say that humans have been selected for the kind of social performance that religion draws on. So religions are really human creations drawing on and integrating some of the evolved human capacities that have been selected. And they reshape them and integrate them in different ways to advance their religious agenda, which we can discuss whether that's good or bad. So I don't think that I don't think Dawkins is entirely right that it's an accidental byproduct. I think that it's we've been selected for this kind of compulsion to be believing and thinking what other people believe and think. And I think John Gray is right that often in atheist movements, you see some of the same kind of dogmatism and sort of doctrinal purity that you also see in monotheistic religions. But I think that those are characteristics of our mind, not characteristics of religion. And so I think with that, let's wrap up that religion is many things across different societies, but these different ways of being religious sort of draw on the human capacities, evolved capacities for social imagination and conformity and absorption. So let's pause there, and I'll take final set of questions.
Great. Yeah, we've had several more questions come in. One that came up was someone was wondering, have there been any studies to see if there's any difference between prayer versus something else like meditation in people who are in the brain imaging scans? Yes,
I meant to put that in, and sorry, I forgot. Yes, they're quite distinctive. So prayer, as I mentioned, prayer seems to activate the striatum and sort of these centers of longing and desire, whereas the meditation tends to repress the activity there and tends to enhance the sort of what you might call the alpha rhythm, the sort of idling, attentive idling of the brain. So they have quite different effects.
Oh, got it. Okay, that's interesting. Now, okay, someone else was wondering about religion being something like almost like a trained response, like a Pavlovian thing, ring the bell and good things come to you. Is there any evidence that that kind of thing might be going on, where people are simply learning that they're rewarded every time they engage in a religious activity or experience, and that it's simply a self-reinforcing kind of thing?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of self-reinforcement in daily life, most of our daily lives. So I would say yes, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's an explanation of religion any more than it's an explanation of driving down, commuting to work, or buying my habitual coffee at wherever I buy my coffee. These are certainly practices. I certainly get more reward from my coffee than from prayer right now. But anyway,
I mean, especially since it's pumpkin spice season.
I'm actually not a pumpkin spice fan, but anyway.
I know that's controversial. Didn't mean to start a debate.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, we've got quite a few more. Do you have any idea on how religion would, and especially kind of looking in the brain, how religion would connect to or affect the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response?
I'm not aware of any study on that. If I had to speculate, I would say that, again, because of this very thick tract coming out from the medial prefrontal areas, which, as we've seen, are very much involved in religious belief and to some extent in religious experience, one of the peculiarities of human brain anatomy is that there's this large projection from there directly to the amygdala. And so I would expect that religion, or for that matter, any intense loyalty to a group, could really, keep you in place in fearful situations, could keep your feet on the ground under fire, so to speak. But I'm not aware of any data to actually warrant that.
Got it. Kara?
Okay, well, we've got plenty more here. Someone else was wondering about when you're talking about heritability of spirituality and interest in these religious experiences, could there be also some environmental factors that are coming into play there that might affect the actual structure of the brain that people have, and so might result in someone having more activity in these structures that might be more associated with religiosity? I think the example someone was giving was something like ADD being associated with limited blood flow in the prefrontal cortex. I'm not familiar with that, but do you kind of get the gist of the question?
I think that's entirely reasonable, and I suspect that's part of the truth. The question is, how much of the truth is it? I mean, we generally see that when people use a brain area more, they build up more synapses or more connections, more wires between all of the cells in that specific area. So if you practice, sleight of hand magic or the violin, you'll build up a lot more synapses in the specific parts of your motor cortex to do with your fingers and hands. But how much of the differences we see, which are quite large, at least by the standards of the effect sizes we typically see for most behaviors, how much of that is explained by experience and how much is explained by genetics? That's a completely open question at this point.
So if you're growing up in a situation where from birth you're being exposed to these practices and ideas, that could be actively changing the structure of your brain so that we wouldn't later on be able to know the difference, whether it's kind of like a chicken or an egg thing, which came first.
Well, it's certainly shaping the fine structure. And I expect it would shape the large scale structure as well. Again, I don't know of any studies that actually show that, but that's what I would expect. I mean, we can certainly see when kids are raised in deprived homes, violent homes, or neglectful homes, most of their prefrontal cortex is somewhat shrunken. So we do see, serious effects on the brain. Which are, if they get caught early enough, are somewhat reversible, but not entirely.
Kind of what you're describing too, with repetition and practice, and connecting to a certain part of a brain time and time again, having that building and strengthening that pathway, it kind of seems to trigger or bring up for me going to church every Sunday on a regular basis, showing up and being given a message, very similar message, or even Wednesdays and Sundays, and that it also seems to correlate or could associate itself with what we see on social media as well. Like if we continue to see right-wing memes or content, or left-wing memes or content, we might strengthen those pathways and pull us one way or another. Do those, am I off track? Do those kind of same effects show up or are enhanced by that kind of regular?
I don't know that anybody's done a study of how brain anatomy changes depending on which websites you listen to on a regular, or frequent on a regular basis, or which podcasts you listen to. I'd be surprised if you could see a large scale effect. Of course, the devil's in the detail, so to speak. It's the fine structure of the synapses that form the specific memories and beliefs. And those would not be visible on a large scale scan. Basically every time you are, doing a new action, you're forming, hundreds of thousands of new synapses and eroding, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of older synapses. It's surprising, it's an astonishing amount of turnover in the brain. We have, something like, several trillion synapses, 6 trillion synapses in our brain, and those, our turnover, in the memory intensive areas are on the order of several percent per day. You do the math, and you're looking at, many millions of synapses are degraded, and many millions new ones are formed to replace them. And of course, if you are spending your time on, Fox News, a lot of your synapses are going to reflect what you hear there or somewhere else.
That kind of seems to imply that, in some sense, if we change our habits, change our behavior, the brain is changeable enough or plastic enough to rewire itself. If a few percent of synapses change every single day, that's a lot more and a lot faster than I thought.
It's a lot more than most of us thought, frankly.
Wow.
This is a bit of a surprise, even to most neuroscientists.
Wow.
It's just been discovered within the last 10 years.
Incredible. Carrie, you got another one?
Yeah, I do. Actually, someone was wondering about, so we've talked a lot about how religious belief and spirituality can be, or maybe in some cases can't be, measured using these brain scans and things like that. So how does that differ from, or not differ from, something like humanism? Can we see that in a brain scan or some other measure?
Again, I've never seen a brain scan of humanists contrasted with religious, contrasted, let's say, with people who aren't involved in any movement. I would that's a good question. And of course, humanists are a diverse group as well. So I wouldn't want to bet on what you'd see. I don't know.
Interesting.
I like that. Let's wrap it up, the Q&A, with one kind of final question, and it's going to be off of your neuroscience work and more towards your humanism work. And kind of would like to hear from you two things, like, what is humanism to you, and how is that any different than any other religion? Because it seems to be more like a philosophy and less a religion.
So if I were to say in just a few words, I'd say that humanism is the search for practical wisdom to human problems and to the attainment of the best kind of individual life and the best society. And that is, I think, very different from at least most people's understanding of religion, because we are searching for wisdom through human experience. And that would be history and science and lived experience, as opposed to being told what to do by a religious authority. And I think one of the things that has resulted in an unfortunate, I think, conflict between humanism and religion cross-culturally is that in many traditional cultures, but not in the West, in many traditional cultures, humanistic wisdom is expressed in kind of traditional religious idioms. But when you actually look at what they're saying, it's entirely based on human experience, and sort of the gods are sort of in the background, warranting it and stamping it and validating it, but it's derived from human experience. And I think if we throw out everything that has any kind of association with religion, we sort of declare war on a lot of the wisdom traditions of lots of other societies, which I think is unfortunate.
So I hear you kind of saying religion in one sense is like a closed system where very little changes within it. But humanism, on the other hand, is a framework that invites change as new information comes along. And
I certainly think so. I think that humanism is by no means finished. The final revelation of Christianity and a final revelation of Islam, etc., they've all happened. But the final revelation of humanism is yet to come. We don't know what we're going to find out. And I think that's especially true. I mean, I don't expect big surprises about the structure of the universe or the atom anymore. Maybe they will come, but I don't expect them. But I do expect substantial shifts in the way we think about human mind and human society.
Dr. Reimers, thank you so very much for joining us this evening, and really, really enjoyed this talk.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, we have a hangout afterwards. Do you have a little bit of time to kind of?
I do have a few minutes now. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Before we, I kind of like to do this before we wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts or final things that you wanted to say that we didn't really cover or talk about?
I think that we should think about religion not as a single entity, but really as a sort of collection of sort of different experiences and different agendas that are unified perhaps by a common metaphorical framework, but which are, interpreted by each individual quite differently. So your religious experience and your leaving religion may be quite different than mine. And that I found it very difficult to leave religion. Some people find it very easy. I'm jealous, but and the particular issues you're facing may be quite distinctive. So I think we should understand that human beings come in tremendous variety, and that's. But maybe that's enough for a wrap up.
Well said. I appreciate that very much. Kara, you want to take us away to the conclusion part?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed hearing that. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to this one again. I love that we get to hear so many sort of perspectives on religious issues coming from, different disciplines and different angles. And this has been fascinating to hear about it kind of from the neuroscience perspective tonight. Really, really cool. So thank you for that. And so next week, everyone, look forward to, we're going to shift gears and do another one of our religion spotlight episodes where we'll be talking about the Amish with Tora, is it Bontrager? I hope I didn't just butcher that. Okay, yeah. Great. So perfect. And that's going to be talking about, as an offshoot of the Mennonites, the Amish have been around since the 17th century and are well known for their public-facing, quaint, and austere lives. However, along with their historical and religious cousins, the Mennonites and other Anabaptists, those who are on the inside know it's not at all an idyllic life within these isolated religious communities. So in this RfRx talk, we'll discuss what the Amish believe and how it's shaped their communities and activities, how it's different different from other Christian belief systems, the difference between the Amish and Mennonite beliefs, and the harm that can come from these beliefs, especially when it comes to education and integrating into the modern world around them. So that will be next week, same time, same place, same bat channel and all that. And as always, all of the previous recordings can be found on our YouTube channel, and this one will also go up there. Give us a little time to do some editing and get it up there, but it will be there too. And any questions, comments, ideas for future shows that you'd like to recommend can be emailed to us at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. And don't forget to check out our blog, Excommunications, as well as our podcast, which you can find on our website. And Eric is dropping all of these links into the chat. And we are also all over the social medias. So be sure to like and subscribe and heart and follow and tweet and all of those things. We're on Facebook. We have a Facebook support group page. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're even on the TikTok. So we've got all those links going into the chat as well. Feel free to find us on whichever of those that you use, and follow us in whatever way it is done on those channels. And then Eric, do you want to talk about the newsletter?
Yep. We have a newsletter that comes out every Sunday, and this newsletter is pretty fantastic. When it comes out, it's got the resources for talks like these. It has information on upcoming events and news about RFR, like our fall excursion that happened a few weeks ago. It talks about recent blog posts that were published, as well as recent YouTube videos that were published as well. So go ahead and I dropped a link in the chat. It'll be in the description and such, and you can sign up for that newsletter. Now, I'm going to bring on our fantastic founder and president, Dr. Ray. And while he's talking, I'm also going to pull up the feedback poll, because we'd love to hear what you thought of this program and others like that. So go ahead and give that a launch. Now, Dr. Darrel Ray, what have you got to say?
Hey, Mark, this was fantastic. I mean, the kind of neurological research that's coming out in the last 10 years is just phenomenal. I can't keep up with it all. And it's great to have kind of a serious update on some stuff. I guess 2015 is kind of where I dropped off. I need to get a little more aggressive in my understanding. I've got a real quick question for you, Mark. Do you know Dr. Jack Wathy?
Sorry, who? Say that name again?
John Wathy. John Wathy. He wrote the book called The Illusion of God's Presence.
I don't know him personally, and I'm not sure. I don't know if I've heard of that book.
Well, he's a computational biologist as well, so you might want to connect with him. He's been a speaker here on RfRx. I'm just going to tell you, Mark, you and Jack would probably have about 3 days worth of things to talk about. You cross each other's paths a lot, and he's in the same academic field as you are, although, well, I'll leave you to figure that out. But anyway, thanks a lot. This has been very, very interesting. And as everybody probably knows that's watching this right now, but you may not be, Mark, we have hundreds of people contacting us every day, every week, every month. And they're dealing with the consequences through our helpline, the consequences of leaving religion. And I'm going to go out on a limb here because I haven't done the statistics, but virtually, I'm going to guess 80, maybe more than 80% of the people who call us or chat in with us, their main concern is maintaining social contacts and social relationships. And how do I do that if I'm leaving religion? How do I maintain my relationship with my family, with my spouse, with my church members and all that? And it is incredibly difficult for people to do that once you leave. So the whole social connection thing really, really, really rings a bell with the community that we're working with right now. And the 128 people that were here tonight to hear you talk, I'm guessing most of them have had to deal with that. So it just, I think, underlines the research stuff that you were talking about. Social relationships are really what the brain's trying to maintain during that.
I would agree with that. That's something we we often forget, as we pursue a very rationalist and individualistic approach. I have another talk on the sort of social psychology of religion, which is more, I noticed someone has cited Era Norenzayan's book or work in the chat, and that focuses more on the evolution of religion and cooperation.
Right. And I hope we hear more from you in the future. I hope Eric schedules you to come back, or you're willing to come back, because I think there's a lot more to explore here. All right. Well, moving right along, to everybody here tonight, thanks for coming. This has been a great talk. If you're interested in neuroscience at all, this has got to just be stimulating your neurological systems all over the place. And we are here as Recovery from Religion to help you deal with those neurological problems that are caused by religious brainwashing, religious indoctrination, and the consequences of losing relationships, losing family members, and stuff like that. I hope you'll do several things. First of all, let people know about us. Let your friends and people who might need us, let them know about us. Tell them to call in, tell them to chat in on the chat line. And because we've got so many people sitting here waiting, literally during this talk, 3 chats came in, and I've watched them, and people were talking about their own issues, and they don't even know what we're doing here tonight. They are not aware of the RfRx. They're just chatting and saying, I'm having trouble with my spouse, or I'm having trouble dealing with the loss of my parents. They've disowned me, that sort of stuff. And if you can, donate. This whole project that you're seeing here, Recovery from Religion, is totally voluntary. Every person here trying to, from Kara to Helen to Eric and everybody else, Rob, everybody's going to stay here afterwards. They're all volunteers. And this thing runs on volunteers, but it also runs on donations from people like you. So if you can donate, get online, hit the donate button, give us $4 a month or something, whatever you can. If you can't do that, let us go on social media and like our stuff and help us get our recognition out. Because right now we are going through a massive growth change. We're expanding dramatically into places like New Zealand and Australia. I am just shocked, and Gail and I are just, like, almost every day we're talking about this shit, trying to figure out how are we gonna keep our arms around all this. It's massive, the number of people who need our help, but we need your support to make that happen. And finally, and probably more important than anything else, if you can volunteer. We are always looking for volunteers. At last count, we have somewhere around 300 semi-active or semi-active volunteers doing stuff every week in some way, shape, or fashion. But we could use 2 or 3 times that many people. And we've got lots of programs that are underfunded and under-volunteered that could use your help. So consider it. And if you can't yourself, let other people know. Help us get the word out. And finally, I'm just so excited to just say we've got incredible expansion going on in Australia, and we've got incredible expansion going on in some other areas. Soon we're going to be opening up a new RfR 3.0, which will allow us to more efficiently answer chats on the internet. And so we're actually going to be capable of taking more chats than we've been taking at the current time. Anyway, that's kind of where we're at here, and it's just fun and amazing to be involved with such a great group of people and recovering from religion. And Eric for producing all this, and thanks Kara, and thanks Helen, thanks others, Rob, whoever's staying here later. Thanks for all the work you're doing to make this happen.